AP US History, Lesson 36, Post-War America, 1945 to 1960. After 15 years of depression and war, and we spent an awful lot of time on the war, at least on foreign policy. We've seen the 1930s, we've seen the big great conflict itself, we've seen the Cold War afterwards. Now to turn exclusively to domestic matters for a moment. After 15 years of depression and war, that artificially changed American social habits. In the 30s, we'd seen marriages, births, and divorces all decline, as well as college attendance, because those things simply couldn't be afforded. During the war, we'd also seen that same phenomenon because you have the nation mobilized to fight this great worldwide struggle, and an awful lot of the men are overseas in this struggle. So you've seen an artificial dislocation of standard domestic social habits. Well, post-1945, that all comes back with an enormous rush as Americans, they seek and achieve a widespread prosperity and a standard of living and a lifestyle that was unprecedented in its scope and breadth on the world scale. After poverty and then war work, you're going to see women, for the most part, return to the domestic sphere generally willingly and generally happily for the most part. And the Depression era decline in marriages and births will completely reverse itself. For a way of example, in the 1930s, the entire decade, there were about 9 million births in the United States. In the 1940s, there were 19 million births, and most of those were post-1945, so actually in the last half of the decade. And in the 1950s, there were 29 million children born. So you can see there's going to be real changes in our social dynamics and our domestic dynamics all through this time period. There was a huge pressure to demobilize the armed forces. It was the so-called Bring My Daddy Home movement that you saw, and men and women wanted to get back to their regular lives, or at least wanted to not even get back, wanted to start a regular life after the years of depression and war. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act, also known as the GI Bill of Rights of 1944, provided mortgage or housing or education benefits to returning veterans and was going to contribute to both the college boom, when we'd seen that big decline in the earlier period, and the housing booms of this post-war era in many ways. It was a real exercise in moving many Americans into middle class and into prosperity, giving them the avenues to achieve both. The government, for its part, under no longer Franklin Roosevelt, but under Harry Truman, is going to really want to take an active role continuing some of these New Deal models. The Employment Act of 1946, passed by a Democratic-controlled Congress and signed by the President, had as its goal full employment. And so the government, is, as a Keynesian model, the government is going to act as an economic manager. This is going to create the Council of Economic Advisors, and we're going to see the Truman administration want to try to have the government as an active sort of manager or fine-tuner of the economy in many ways. So we're seeing Harry Truman seek to kind of continue the New Deal, big government liberal state that we'd seen Roosevelt enshrine into place over his four terms that he was elected to. At the end of this war, just like at the end of World War I, we see a lot of the same kind of themes. A fear of communism, a second Red Scare. We also see labor disputes. We see inflation. And you can think about why, at least for some of these. Inflation was a post-war concern in 1919, just as it's going to be in 1946. During the war, everybody worked, so they all had money in their pockets. During the war, they also had little to spend it on because we were busy making tanks and bombers and machine guns and helmets, and we weren't making toasters and vacuum cleaners and ovens and television sets and automobiles. And so, since consumer goods took a back seat to wartime production, you had a lot of dollars in a lot of people's hands chasing a very small amount of goods. Your basic supply and demand stuff you learn in economics should tell you that prices are going to rise then. So additionally, all the wartime agencies like the Office of Wartime Management, the National War Labor Board, the Office of Price Administration, War Production Board, all of which your classes talked about and we talked about in our World War I lecture or World War II lecture, all those government agencies are phased out. So we see prices rising faster than consumers' wages. So labor sees their purchasing power drop, what the so-called real wages drop, and you see another wave of strikes after World War II, just like the ones after World War I. So you see them in coal, automobile industry, steel, railroad strikes. And the passing of the Employment Act of 1946 was part of the government saying, we're going to take a step here. Very different step than we saw at the Red Scare where we're going to break unions. Take some very different steps after World War II to try to stabilize the economy and guarantee that return to full employment for people. However, by 1947, a Republican-controlled Congress, after the 46 elections, a Republican-controlled Congress is going to pass the Taft-Hartley Act, which is going to outlaw the closed shop. In other words, a place of employment where to join that place of employment, you have to join a labor union that is representing that place of employment. It's an anti-labor measure, and we're going to see many of the labor deals of the labor gains of the 30s and 40s. We're going to see Republicans and conservatives on the right try to, in the 1950s, roll some of that back. That being said, this is still the golden era of the labor union in the United States from the 30s through probably at least the 60s, when we see big labor with major gains in major industries, or at least preserving the major gains they've already gotten during this time. Nevertheless, despite these pains of reconversion to a peacetime economy, post-war domestic United States was an era or a time of real optimism when all people, it seemed the middle-class lifestyle, the middle-class opportunities were available to all of them. The war had successfully done what Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal had failed to do. The war had redistributed some income from the wealthiest people, wealthiest factors in society, to the common man and woman. It kind of successfully spread some of that out. And so we saw in the 1950s the masses of the American population going on a binge of consumer domestic spending as this middle-class lifestyle seems available to all. Automobile purchases went way up, home purchases went way up, and production of both went way up during this time. And these things are linked. You have the creation of suburbia. You start having people leaving the cities to live outside the cities and work downtown, the so-called creation of bedroom communities, if you will. You see cities become centers of work and suburbs become centers of residence. And so people would flee the cities nightly to return to their homes. And it's the creation of something which probably many of you watching this film live in now, a subdivision, a pre-planned, pre-laid out set of houses in a neighborhood, in a community, if you will. Bill Levitt, industrial or a housing contractor, establishes the community of Levittown, New York, on Long Island, outside of New York City. It's the first of these large-scale, pre-planned, prefabricated subdivisions with housing that's all sort of, for lack of a better term, sort of cookie cutter. Similar homes and similar city blocks all looking like being built the same way. And so it would be a fair analogy to call Bill Levitt the Henry Ford of housing in many ways, applying mass production techniques to the homes and standardization to this production, which is going to allow for more to be built, but also more access for people because the price is going to drop. So we're going to see the public school movement during this time, the baby boom coming out. We're going to see suburban sprawl. We're going to see school consolidations, shopping mall culture, congestion. Much of that comes out of this entire era. The suburbs, as you know them, might be living in newer, different ones, but they still have their roots in the way the suburban model originally started in the post-war period. In this issue as well, you look at the notions of stability and comfort. We're seeing rises in the standard of living for people. We also see rises in civil rights. That standard of living is trying to be sought after. The American dream is being sought after by all Americans, not just the white middle-class Americans or white Americans who had done an awful lot of the serving in the military and fighting in the Second World War. So you see during this time period, Truman comes out with what he calls the Fair Deal. The Fair Deal was going to call for civil rights legislation. It was going to call for housing and farm programs, minimum wage, labor reforms, and it's going to meet with mixed results. After 15 some years of the New Deal, the Fair Deal is a continuation of it. It's going to really slow its momentum, and particularly because you have dissension among the Democrats on the issues of civil rights. In 1947, Jackie Robinson had broke the color line in baseball, famously integrating Major League Baseball. In 1948, Harry Truman desegregates the armed forces and integrates units, having mixed units of black and white based on race. And in 1948, pushes for a civil rights plank in the Democratic Party platform. This leads the South to bolt the party. And you see Southern Democrats becoming uncomfortable within their own party on this issue of race. They'd always been staunch Democrats as long as the implicit bargain was we're not going to talk about issues of race and civil reform in the South. And Strom Thurmond, senator from South Carolina, will bolt and run a third-party campaign as a so-called Dixiecrat, representing a campaign for Southern votes. He gets a lot of Southern votes, and this is symbolic and significant because beginning in the post-World War II period, the Democratic Party is going to begin to lose the South. They're going to begin to lose them as a voter base, which they'd been since the era of Reconstruction. But Truman is going to seek to continue this New Deal big government activism and use the government as an economic manager. And he's going to try to build the big labor New Deal society. And that's going to, as we said, meet with some mixed results because you are going to see pushback from the Republican right.